Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Pound and we are studying Chapter 3.2 on plant activity from Purposeful Designs Life Science. Today we're going to talk about Section 3.2.2 on Angiosperm Reproduction. So our objectives today are to identify the reproductive structures of angiosperms and describe the conditions necessary for seed germination. So let's first take a look at the parts of a flower, and you'll find this diagram in your book on page 140. The first structure I want to talk about are the sepals. These are the leaf-like structures that cover and protect the immature flower. So here are the sepals, and these have opened up and the petals are out now, but these green leaf-like things at the bottom of the flower. And so here on the diagram, they're right here. It's called a sepal or a calyx, but that is also sepal is another name. The brightly colored parts of a flower are called petals, so you're probably really familiar with that. So here are the petals on our diagram. Now the stamen is the male reproductive structure of the flower, and it includes a filament and an anther. So these white structures here are the stamen. That is the male part of the flower. And so here we have a stamen. The whole structure is a stamen, as it is labeled over here. It is on top of a filament. So the filament is this long part, and the anther is at the top, which contains the pollen. So the dust-like particles that carry the sperm cells of plants are called pollen, and those are produced in the anther, which is part of the stamen on top of the filament. So right here is that pollen on the top of that filament up here. The pistil is the female reproductive structure of a flower. So the pistil is right here. Here are our stamen. So right here, they don't really have this labeled entirely, but this is the pistil. They don't have pistil on this, but this is the pistil. At the top of the pistil is the stigma. It's at the tip. And the stigma is sticky because pollen will stick to the stigma. So right here is that sticky stigma that collects the pollen. The style is the long, slender part of the pistil. So this is the style. It is slender. So the style is this part right here that sticks out. The ovary is the rounded base of the pistil. So this one isn't so rounded, but the ovary's down here at the bottom of the pistil. And you can see here the stamen, the stigma, the style of this tulip. The anthers, the filament. So they look different for different plants. So here, down here is the ovary, and they have a cutout over it here to make it look bigger. Inside of the ovary are the ovules. This is the structure that contains the egg cell of a seed plant. So it's inside here at the bottom of the ovaries. And these are the ovules, and they each contain an egg cell waiting to be pollinated. Angiosperms are pollinated by birds, insects, bats, wind, and water. And here I have corn in a cornfield, and corn is pollinated by the wind. There are some flowers that will be out at night, and they will be pollinated by bats. Bees for insects, birds, especially like hummingbirds, will pollinate, and some with water. Some flowers are fragrant because the fragrance attracts insects and birds to pollinate the flower. It attracts us, right? We like flowers that smell good, and so others attract insects. There is even a plant that smells like rotting meat that attracts insects in order for it to be pollinated. Plants that use wind for pollination do not need the fragrance. So plants that don't use other things other than insects and maybe bats and birds don't tend to have very much of a scent because they don't need to attract anything. Most angiosperms cross-pollinate, some self-pollinate. The reason for cross-pollination is because it just makes better plants, hardier plants, less prone to disease than self-pollination does. How angiosperms produce seeds. Pollen, usually from another plant of the same species, falls on the sticky stigma at the top of the pistil. So pollen gets on the stigma, and usually from another plant. Remember, cross-pollination is more desirable. The pollen triggers the growth of a pollen tube that leads down to the ovary. So you'll have your pollen up here, and there will actually be this tube that grows down into the ovary. One of the two nuclei on the pollen grain divides to form sperm. These travel to the ovary. So in this pollen grain, you'll have this reaction that goes on that produces a sperm cell, and that sperm cell will travel through the pollen tube down to the ovary. One combines with the ovule to form a zygote. The other helps develop the tissue that supplies food for the growing embryo. An embryo is an organism in its earliest stage of development. So these seeds were once embryos. Now they wouldn't be categorized so much as embryos now, perhaps, but in their earliest stage, when it's that first cell, it's a zygote, and then it becomes an embryo, and they are inside these seeds waiting to mature and then be distributed. A seed's germination is highly dependent on the temperature of its environment. So, and that's a good thing because around here we don't want seeds germinating during the winter and then freezing and dying. So they wait in the soil, and the soil reaches a certain temperature and they start to germinate. They start to sprout like this seed here. Angiosperms, for the most part, reproduce sexually and asexually here. They can do both. However, all reproduce sexually, so all angiosperms will produce seeds. Now, we do have seedless varieties of different plants, and that's due to a mutation. And then we have to reproduce those vegetatively or asexually. So some can reproduce vegetatively. And so here we see different plants coming off of this potato. We could cut each off and it would be a different plant. And so that is one way that they can reproduce vegetatively. Many set out rhizomes underneath the soil that produce other plants, and there are lots of examples of that. If you've ever taken a cutting of, say, a cactus and grown roots off of it, that's an example of vegetative reproduction. So our objectives today were to identify the reproductive structures of angiosperms and describe the conditions necessary for seed germination. Don't forget your 5 questions in your notes and keep watching this video to answer the questions at the end.